Hi, welcome to Board Gems. This is my weekly-ish video series in which I cover older board game gems, and that's exactly what I'm not doing this week. I'm just playing around, doing a few different types of videos. There's a type of video I did in the past called a Rough Cuts, which I got some positive feedback on, so we're going to do another Rough Cuts episode. But strangely, this episode is not going to be about older games. These games are relatively recent, just 3 to 5 years old. And that's the Puzzle Trilogy from designer Uwe Rosenberg and artist Andrea Boekhoff and publisher Spielwiese. They have kind of seasonal themes, nature themes, starting with Cottage Garden in 2016, which had kind of a spring, summery, planting flowers theme. And then there was after that was Indian Summer in 2017, I believe, and that had a autumnal theme. And in 2018, it had Spring Meadow, which was sort of a winter transitioning to spring melting snow theme. Same designer, same artist, same publisher, and they all feature those polyominoes, those Tetris-like pieces, although they're not just 4 squares, they could be 5 or even 6. Polyomino games are really popular. There's a lot of them out there, and actually my wife and I have been on a bit of a polyomino kick. So I'm actually going to talk about these 3 games. Because they're not old enough, I'm not going to do full how to play and why it's a gem video on any of them, but I did want to talk about them. So the first game I'm going to talk about is the one that probably most people would have heard of, at least on Board Game Geek. It has the most ratings, the most comments. It's the oldest. It's the first in the trilogy, Cottage Garden. It came out in 2016. Now, the idea of this is that each player has at one time 2 flower bed boards. They're relatively small. I think they're like 6 by 6 squares. And there's on these flower beds, there are flower pots and I guess plant covers, like plastic or glass plant covers that are pre-printed on some of the spaces. And you want to fill up your boards, but preferably not cover too many of those, because those are what are going to score you points. You're going to be drafting polyominoes. You're going to be drawing them from a central board, which is I think a 4x4 grid. And so each player, when their turn comes around, there's going to be a marker that moves around the outside, and that's going to dictate what row or column or sometimes diagonal that a player can draw pieces from. So you have any of those choices. If there's too few, you can refill. And you can see which pieces are going to be refilled because there's a big line of polyominoes kind of on the table with a little wheelbarrow showing where the front is. On your turn, you're going to take a polyomino and you're going to put it on one of your 2 boards. So you can cover the flower pots if you want to, but you don't have to, and in fact you're not encouraged to do that. You want to fill up all the empty spaces and cover as few flower pots as possible. The reason is because each player has their own scoreboard, and the scoreboard has 3 orange markers, which represent the flower pots, and 3 blue markers, which represent the sort of the plant shields, plant covers. Whenever you fill a player board, you're going to be filling several of them over the course of the game. As you fill up a flower bed, you're going to remove the polyominoes. You're basically going to put that into the center, and whatever's in the center you're going to take, and now you're going to have a new flower bed to fill. So, and there's a set number of rounds, so you're basically trying to fill your flower beds as fast as possible, because the more flower beds you complete, the more points you're going to score. But when you score points, you assign the points to 2 of your markers, so 1 orange, 1 blue. There's a few considerations. One is if you're able to get all of your markers of a particular color off the starting space, you'll get a bonus. Whenever one of your markers crosses a sort of threshold about halfway, you're going to get a different bonus. And you also want to try to time it. There's an end space. It tops out at a certain score, so I think it's 20 points. And so you don't want to, if you're going to score 6 points with your flower pots, with your orange markers, you don't want to move an orange marker that's only 4 spaces away, because whatever is excess is lost. So you do want to try to use up as many of the points as possible to move markers ahead, but you also want to get them onto the end space because there's a little bit of a bonus if you do that. So there's a little bit of a kind of a sub game there. The game is somewhat repetitive. It's a set number of rounds. So there's a marker, which is a die. And every time it makes a complete circuit around the board, that's one round, and you rotate die so it shows an extra pip. And you do that several times, and then you're sort of in like sudden death. And in sudden death, if your board has kind of is partially completed, you can finish it, but every round it takes you to do that, you lose points, actually. So there's kind of some interesting things going on. It is definitely a polyomino game, and it is very unique, and it really shows the creativity of the designer Uwe Rosenberg. So I've talked about this before because Uwe Rosenberg, he's a very creative game designer, and he kind of thinks in a bit of a different way than some other designers. I'm not very good at describing it, but he comes up with a very interesting sort of 0 point, sort of the middle ground, the default. And he does it very well in Cottage Garden. It's a very interesting sort of dynamic because your goal is to fill up your flower beds as fast as possible. At the same time, when you want to fill a flower bed, you don't want to cover up too many flower pots. But when you're drawing a piece, maybe it's perfect, except it'll cover a flower pot. You can not take that. You can take a smaller piece often, and then you can kind of work around it. But if it takes more turns to complete the flower bed as a result, maybe you don't want to do that. The goal really is to complete as many as possible, because every flower bed you complete, you're scoring points for. So that's a really interesting kind of decision point. Now, I will say that the flower beds are very small. They're 6 by 6, and you're not really trying to fit the polyominoes together so much. Instead, you're just trying to fill empty gaps with the spaces pre-printed, and you are able to cover them, but you don't have to. On the one hand, it makes it a little more flexible because you don't have to have the exact piece. You can get one a little bit bigger, a little bit different shape, but there's a little bit of a penalty for it. But in the end, those flower beds are quite restrictive because they're very small, and each one is only going to have, by the end, 4 or 5 pieces on it. And it's not as much trying to fit them together. Anyway, the feeling is they're relatively restrictive. And especially in, for example, a 2-player game, there's only 5 double-sided flower beds in play. So each player starts with 2, and there's going to be 1 set aside, kind of in the middle of the table. And every time somebody completes a flower bed, they take the one that's in the middle, and then the one that they finish, they flip over upside down and put it out and available to whoever next finishes a flower bed. But it is very possible that over the course of the game, you're going to see the same flower beds again. There's only 10 different ones, and players will maybe get the same ones over the course of the game. The game is a little bit longish, so you're looking at maybe like a 60-minute game. And the age range for this game says 8 and up, which I actually strongly disagree with. The third game in the series is simpler than this one, and that says 10 and up. This one is easily a 10 and up game. And don't let the weight ratings on Board Game Geek fool you. It is much harder to explain than the weight rating would have you believe. It is a very abstruse game, but it's also the most gamery of the trilogy, because in the end you're playing for points. All 3 of the games have different winning conditions, interestingly. In Cottage Garden, you're playing a set number of rounds, and then whoever has the highest score at the end wins. So without playing the other 2, I actually really liked Cottage Garden. And it was a polyomino game that had a real kind of game there, but it wasn't necessarily an intuitive game. Like I said, on Board Game Geek, you might be fooled by the age range and by the weight rating. You might think this is a light family game. And a better player will almost always win because there is a second level to think about the game, which is how the score markers move. And also getting those bonuses and timing it so that you get the bonuses at the right time so you can apply them in a way you need. Really a lot of great ideas. Returning to the game after playing some others in the series, it felt rather limiting, rather restrictive, because the flower beds are quite small. The board in which you're drawing tiles from is quite small. You don't have very much choice in that regard. I still enjoy the game. I used to really like it, and I'm a little bit less hot on it now. But as a polyomino game, it definitely has some interesting ideas, and it's definitely worth a try. And it's worth at least 2 tries. That first game is going to feel a little bit like a mess, but if you stick with it, it is a pretty rewarding game too. For a family of gamers, and ones who don't mind a little bit of a long game, Cottage Garden is probably the longest of the 3, although the third game in the series, we're going to talk about that, because that one varies wildly. Anyway, I would say Cottage Garden is the second best of the 3 of the trilogy. So the second game in the series is called Indian Summer, and this has an autumnal theme with leaves on a forest floor. Very appealing, probably in terms of art style and the look of the game. This is my favorite of the 3. Unlike Cottage Garden, in which you're playing for straight points, instead in Indian Summer, it's a race. So in Indian Summer, each player has their own board, which is relatively sizable. Your goal is to fill it up. The first player to fill up their entire board wins. And of course you fill it up with polyominoes. Now, unlike Cottage Garden, there isn't a board that you're drafting from. Instead, players will have a row of pieces in front of them. And on their turn, they can play one of the 5. And it's only when all 5 are gone, then they draw the next 5 that are sort of in a row. The polyomino part is really interesting, and what they've done is they've introduced a new concept, which are these polyominoes have holes in them. And the holes are ideally used to leave exposed certain icons that are pre-printed on the board. And the boards are double-sided, and there's several different ones, so you got some variety. But what you want to do is arrange the holes over these icons, because the real meat of the game really is in these bonus tokens. So there's 4 different bonus tokens. They allow you to refill your row early instead of waiting for it to be all used up. You can actually steal pieces from other players, although you don't have much choice in terms of which ones. That is always like the first one in their line. You can play 2 at once, and you can fill up like a 1-by-1, just a little single space on your board. So a big part of the game is using these tokens. You collect these tokens, and you'll collect a lot of tokens over the course of the game, and it's natural for players to kind of want to hoard them. But because it's a race, that's kind of where it starts to fall flat a little bit. So you have these holes covering these, exposing these icons. And when you do that, you place a token on the hole, on the polyomino. And you leave it there until that section of the board is completely filled with polyominoes. And then any tokens that you've exposed and have a little token sitting on there, you get into your personal collection. And they're worth different values. So you can actually convert 2 of one into 1 of another, and there's a hierarchy. And at the end of the game, once one player fills up their board, all the other players convert all their tokens to acorns, basically. And acorns are the ones that allow you to fill up like a single space on your player board. You fill up as many single spaces as you can, and then it's whoever fills up their board, and if it's a tie, then whoever has the most tokens left. So a big part of the game is getting tokens. And as people play, they're very tempted to hoard the tokens as they get them. So they collect lots of tokens, but it's hard to see like exactly when the right time is to use some of them. You'll almost get more icons than you intuitively would need if you're just playing for fun. I don't know if this makes sense, but it's an important part of the game if you want to win. It can also mean that a player who has collected a lot of tokens can basically jump to the end. They can take all their tokens, convert them all to acorns, fill up all the rest of their spaces, and they're like, okay guys, it's over. And people are like, oh, what? It's over already? You look like you still have a lot of spaces left. It's like, yeah, but I converted them all to acorns and I filled up the rest of the spaces all in one go. That part's a little bit unsatisfying. I do like the fact that there's a proper end goal, which is in this case a race to fill your board. I think that's great. This is actually my least favorite of the 3 games. And there are rules in it which I don't feel like they add a lot to the game. So I'll give you an example. There's also a rule which states that if you get holes next to each other forming a certain pattern, you get this extra polyomino which has an animal on it. So it's like, okay, great. So you put that on your board, right, to fill up those empty spaces? No, you put them over the holes, cover the holes, and then you get a bunch of the tokens again. So you're basically getting twice the tokens then. Fortunately, that rule you can leave completely out, especially if you're playing with kids. Game still works great. But there are things about the game that just leave me in general unsatisfied. And that's an example of a rule that really wasn't, it was like an extra level that they wanted to add to, I guess, add a little bit more depth and strategy, like give you something else to work on, which is arranging your holes together. But I don't find that satisfying, and the benefit you get is more tokens, and that's what the game is about, getting more and more and more tokens and using them in tiny ways, right? You use a feather, there's only one feather on your board. What does it do? It allows you to place 2 pieces on your turn instead of 1, and the feather's gone. These tokens don't really do lots of fun things. They just give you tiny benefits around the margins. But it works, and it works fine. And just that ending, because it can kind of sneak up on players if they're not paying attention to how many tokens players have. People's natural nature is to collect tokens and not spend them as they get them. And when that happens, the end of the game can kind of be rushed. If one player has a lot of tokens and then just converts them all into acorns, it just fills up their board suddenly, and the other players aren't paying attention to that, it can sneak up and it can leave kind of an unsatisfying feeling in people's mouths. So yeah, this is my least favorite of the 3, my family's least favorite of the 3. We've played it several times, and it's never gotten better. Even after the more you play it, it still has that kind of anticlimactic feeling by the end. If you're going to have a race game where it's the first player to do something wins, you want to be able to see that end coming, and you want to be able to do things, kind of try to catch up and for it to be close. And I guess on paper, Indian Summer should be like that. I just find in practice it isn't. I don't like Indian Summer, and it's a shame because in terms of the presentation, the art style, it would probably be my favorite, but it's the least satisfying to play of the 3. So now the third game in the series is Spring Meadow. And I'm going to say up front, this is my favorite of the 3, but there's a caveat there, so I'll come back to that at the end. So this one came out in 2018, and I would say it is the simplest of the 3. Each player has their own board, which is 10 spaces wide and something like 14 spaces tall or something. And there's a central board, just like Cottage Garden, except it's larger. Instead of 4x4, it's 5x5. You're going to fill up the board. There's a huge variety of polyominoes, some really strange and interesting pieces in there. And they have holes, and we'll come back to that. So that's something that's borrowed from Indian Summer. Your board has these little gopher holes. I think they're marmots or something, but I call them gopher holes. They're little holes anyway. During the game, there's periodic scoring. As players are drafting polyominoes and placing them on their board, they are trying to put holes together, just like in Indian Summer. When they do that, they're able to get tiny polyominoes that they can also place, just little 1s and 2s and 3s and 4s. And you're trying to avoid the holes that are pre-printed on the board, or place the holes of the polyominoes over the holes that are pre-printed on the board. So the board is a snowscape, but the polyominoes are all grassy meadow. And you're encouraged when you play to place them at the bottom of your board, because when the marker, because it's like Cottage Garden, there's a marker that moves around the board. When it reaches a row that doesn't have very many polyominoes in it, you stop the game and you score. And everybody totals up their scores on their board. Their scores are basically 10 points for every complete row starting from the bottom and going up to and including the first incomplete row. Any complete rows above that aren't counted. So complete, 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 incomplete, stop. I mean, I guess in terms of art style, it's the simplest of the 3. They don't have really pretty flowers. They don't have leaves on the ground. But it's a very nice presentation because it's a snowscape that gradually from the bottom up the snow starts melting and you start seeing the grass underneath. That's the effect. Very nice looking game in that sense. Now, when you get a score, you don't write it down. You just figure out who has the highest score. So again, you're looking at rows up to your first incomplete row and including that. And you also score bonus points for marmot holes that you expose with a hole in your polyomino, and you'll get points for that. And at the end of the round, at the end of that scoring, so whoever has the highest score gets a marker, a token, that says they won the round. The player who won the round covers up their marmot hole, so they're not going to be able to score those again. So it's a very slight penalty and allows other players a chance to catch up a little bit. Then you refill the board, and then you keep playing. And at the end, the winner is the first player to win 2 rounds. So pretty simple. I've explained most everything. It's a really, really simple game to learn. It still has that abstruse nature that all 3 of these games have. Just something about most of Uwe Rosenberg's games to show that his brain doesn't think like most people's. And new people coming in, like people who aren't necessarily hobbyists, come into this, they might be confused at first, but once they kind of get it, it's actually not that hard to learn. I would say it's probably the simplest of the 3, and even though the box says 10 and up, I say this one's 8 and up. And Cottage Garden, which says 8 and up, should be 10 and up. That's my opinion. This game is really good, and it's almost great. Almost. There's just one problem, and that's the way you win the game is winning 2 rounds. What happens is that in a 2-player game, ideally, I win a round, you win a round, and then whoever wins the 3rd round, they're going to win, right? So at most, it's going to take 3 rounds. Maybe you win 2 rounds in a row. Okay? So that was a shorter game, right? That only lasted 2 rounds instead of 3. Now picture a 4-player game. A 4-player game can last 2 rounds, or it can last 5 rounds. To me, that's crazy. That you have no idea how long this game is going to be. It could be over in 20 minutes, or it could take an hour. And you don't know. And some people don't mind that. I know that's a complaint that I have about games like Race for the Galaxy and Roma, which is a game that's been suggested for the channel, is games that can end early. And a lot of people say like, oh, that's okay. If it's over quickly, just play it again. But I want a more consistent expectation of what experience I'm going to have when I play the game. I don't want to sit down at a game and not know whether it's going to take 15 minutes or over an hour, right? And Spring Meadow is like that. If Spring Meadow had a scoring system where you write down the scores every round and just total them up at the end, similar to Cottage Garden. Of course, Cottage Garden has like a little, which markers to move and win kind of mini game going on. But if Spring Meadow was just write down the scores every round and at the end total them up, I think this would be one of the best polyomino games on the market. And it's so good, but that winning a round thing is so dissatisfying that my wife and I, and this is not something we normally do, have actually tried to tweak the game ourselves, tweak the rules, and try to come up with our own way of just scoring for points. I'll tell you what we do, what works for us, but keep in mind, we're not game designers, okay? And in terms of the balancing and that's stuff that I don't feel comfortable doing. I'll just say what works for us. We record the scores at the end of the round. We don't cover up the marmot holes. So the marmot holes that are exposed will score you every round. So it's extra encouragement to leave those exposed. But otherwise, we score everything exactly the same. We just write down the scores at the end of the round instead of declaring a winner of the round. I will say that our games are insanely close. We'll play 4 rounds. 4 rounds seems good for us because that will fill up most of the board. And so we'll write down the scores after every round and do that 4 times, and whoever has the highest score at the end wins. But those scores are always crazy, crazy close. Like the scores are going to be by the end like over 200, and somebody's going to win by like 2 or 3. So that may be unsatisfying. We're fine with it. It is an activity anyway. But I want you to have that heads up. That's a variant we use, but it might not be best for everyone because we haven't balanced it, right? There is a rule in the game that in the normal game that if it was your turn, but you don't get a chance to play because there aren't enough pieces, so the round ends and you score, you get a bonus 2 points. Do you do that with our variant? We don't know. We do, but we're not sure if we should be, right? We don't have the skill in balancing, and maybe if we played another 50, 100 times. If you're the type of player, and I don't blame you if you are, who would be really unsatisfied scoring 200 points and winning or losing by a couple, you might not want to do my variant. The way out of the box it works, and maybe it'll work great for you, just for me and my wife and my son, very, very unsatisfying. Just not knowing, sometimes it's a route and sometimes it's close. And when it's close, it's great, but it's a route a little bit too often. I will say that Spring Meadow is the newest game, but it also has the fewest owners, the fewest ratings. So I think if you're at all interested in Spring Meadow, you should not wait. You should try to get a copy pretty soon. I don't really expect it to be reprinted. I think most of these 3 games, they're pretty much ones and dones, I think. Uwe Rosenberg is always coming up with new polyomino games, right? There's New York Zoo, which is a relatively new one at the time of recording. Anyway, thanks for watching this Rough Cuts video of the Uwe Rosenberg Spielwiese Andrea Boekhoff trilogy of puzzle games, seasonal puzzle games, and just sharing my thoughts. Hope you enjoyed it. Thanks for watching, and remember, not that these are older games, but older games don't stop being good just because newer games come out. Take care.